Hi class, this is Dr. Fred Haltom. I just wanted to introduce the course with a question. And the question is very simple, something that you should be able to answer by the end of this course as we get into it. This is something I want you to reflect on throughout the course. I'm going to ask it at the beginning of a course on a quiz and at the very end of the course. I would like to see some development of your thoughts along this. And the question is basically, what is the New Testament? Surely that's an obvious question, right? Well, maybe it's not so obvious. We want to think about several ingredients that need to be in your answer. Something to frame your thinking with would be these three questions. What is it? What's it about? And what does it do? In regard to what it is, or what is it, I want you to think in terms of the New Testament as literature. That is, literarily, it's composed of 27 books, kind of like an anthology, written by different authors, Hellenized Greeks, of course, Hellenized Jews, but all these different authors, different times, different places, different audiences. But specifically as literature, we have different kinds of genres in the New Testament. So we have the genre of gospel, very unique to the ancient world. It's very much like ancient biography. Ancient historiography and biography had a lot of similar characteristics with the Gospels. But the Gospels are sort of a combination of both those ancient literary genres. And so it has a reading contract of its own. And we need to learn what that is. And we need to be able to talk about gospel. Also to be able to talk about historical narrative in the book of Acts. The genre of letter writing, epistolary literature of the first century and what that looked like. And the reading contracts of logical discourse within it. And the kind of rhetoric that we find there. There are a lot of different kinds of things that you can think of when it talks about what is it. We also have the genre of apocalyptic for the book of Revelation. And so ancient apocalyptic literature was a very common genre, especially when people's groups were going through suffering. So what is the New Testament? You start out with thinking about it as literature, and then you go to the next question, what is it about? And here I want to think about that overall, overarching, big picture of what the New Testament is. And here we want to think about its relationship to the Old Testament as well. And so as it is the fulfillment of so many promises that God made to the people of Israel, starting with the Abrahamic covenant and going through the Old Testament and the large, huge events that we think of there, starting with perhaps when God's dealing with redemption of mankind. We talk about big events like the Garden of Eden and the fall of man and the Tower of Babel and Noah and the flood, and then the huge event in chapter 12 of Genesis of the calling of Abraham and the beginning of the promise of blessing all nations, all Gentiles, everybody, through the seed of Abraham. Of course, in Galatians chapter 3, Paul picks that up and talks about how that seed, the singular seed, was Christ himself. But we also think about these huge big events, the watershed events in the Old Testament, the entering into the Exodus out of Egypt, the entering into the Promised Land, the initiation of the kingdoms and the splitting of the kingdoms, the going into exile because of disobedience, the coming back, the return from the exilic period, and the rebuilding of the temple. And that temple, the second temple, was the second temple period, and that is the period that we're in when we come to the days of Jesus. And so what is it about? It's about the fulfillment of that story, what God began in the Old Testament. God is completing in the New Testament. So we need to think of those connections. And the big, huge events in the New Testament, of course, is part of that storyline. And we need to know about that storyline. What's it about? The birth of the Messiah, the his baptism, beginning of ministry, his death on the cross, the resurrection, the big event of Pentecost, huge, of course, the pivotal event of all the New Testament is the resurrection. It verified all that Jesus did and said and continued to do and say through his apostles in the book of Acts. So what's it about? We need to know that storyline. We need to know that it continued through the early church and has a future in its completion that's lined out for us in the book of Revelation. So what is it about? That's that huge, big overview. It's connections to the Old Testament. It's a continuation of the story of redemption. And then finally, what does it do? You need to think in terms of what does it do in terms of our understanding of God and who he is, and of Christ, his Christ, and who we are as mankind, and our need for redemption in the Redeemer Christ. And so these huge perennial questions that the New Testament answers about who we are as a people, our character, and what it says about us, who we are as, our fallen condition, our redeemed condition, and what is our future, our future glorified condition that we'll have in the new heavens and the new earth. So what does it do? What does it tell us about who God is, who we are, and what our future is from their perspective? So use these 3 questions to frame your reflection on that larger question of what is the New Testament. Be prepared to answer that. So let's do a little exercise, and I would like for you to just open your New Testament and flip open to any passage and start reading it. And maybe you open to a passage that's right on. It applies directly to you right now where you're at. But perhaps you didn't. Perhaps you came into a passage where there was a name that you couldn't pronounce, a custom that you didn't understand, something that was said that left you scratching your head and saying, what is that about? Or maybe even ended up in one of the genealogies, a couple of them there. And so this is the point where a lot of people scratch their head and just say, the Word of God doesn't really seem to be addressing me. It's the Word of God for somebody else, somewhere else, some other time. But, we've all been there. And so if you've been frustrated, I just want you to, with trying to understand the Bible, I just want you to know that we've all been there and that it's not inaccessible. It is something that as we go through our study of the New Testament, it will open up to you, and I hope it'll lay a foundation for you to engage the Word of God and grow in your spiritual walk with God throughout the rest of your life.